first keynote is called Pushing the Boundaries of Integrated Transformation Through Embedded People Analytics. Love the title, love the spirit of that title. And we will hear from Kevin Richards, who is the head of quality investigations and analytics at AstraZeneca. So please give me a warm welcome, and Kevin a warm welcome. You got it. Need a clicker? Yeah, you got it. Thanks.
Hello? Okay, awesome. I don't think I could have had a better introduction to my talk here if I paid Ian $20. We've never met before, but a lot of the things that Ian's talking about within his introduction there is going to be persistent through what I'm going to talk about. And really, what I'm here to do is kind of break down the silos between people and integrated analytics across the organization, just based on my experience. So it's really nice to be here. It's my first People Analytics Summit that I've been to, so I'm looking to learn a lot from a lot of different people in this room. And hopefully together at the end of the next 2 days, we all come away with something valuable that we can take back to our organizations and use. So the nice thing about Gen AI and things like ChatGPT is I used to have to think about a definition when I go to do a conference like this, but now I can just say, okay, well, what's the definition for People Analytics that I can use? And Ian had probably a better one, but it's the definitions that I was seeing when I first put it into ChatGPT were very HR-centric. And I get that maybe I'm probably the wrong person to be talking about this at a People Analytics Summit, since I'm not specifically in People Analytics and HR, but I do use people data throughout all of the integrated analytics strategies that I've built out over my career. And I'm not going to go through that definition right now, but essentially, I want to talk a little bit about my experience and why I believe I'm up here talking to you guys today. So I've worked across multiple industries and organizations building up analytics strategies from the ground up. So building up analytics, reporting, data science, and the way that we look at different business problems across the entire enterprise of an organization. So one of the first organizations that I did this at was called Skyjack. It's a global construction equipment manufacturer based out of Guelph, Ontario, owned by Linamar. And what's really interesting to me over my career as I kind of make this journey is the degree in which people are thought about in these different integrated business problems that you see. So within an organization like Skyjack, which is very manufacturing focused, goods, manufacture, things like that, it's more of like an input when you think about people. So if we have this many people, how many products can we build, or how many widgets can we build? And as I've expanded on my career, so I went from Skyjack, where I built up their analytics strategy, and then I went to Hamilton Health Sciences. And that's a huge shift because I was going to more of a service-based industry, healthcare, and really people are front and foremost when you're thinking about those industries. It's like the nursing, the doctors, the services that you provide has a direct impact on the level of satisfaction in your patients, the level of care that you can provide and things like that. And then 2 years ago, I went to AstraZeneca and kind of took on a unique, different role for me in my career, which is to get into like the quality of clinical trials. And I have an analytics background. I knew nothing about clinical trials, but what I know when I went in there is that we could be applying analytics, people analytics, data to these problems that all of these pharmaceutical organizations are having in this quality space. So some people might not believe this, but the pharma industry is actually quite far behind when it comes to technology, analytics, things like that. And specifically in the quality space, and this is kind of what I'm going to get into my talk, when you talk about like silos, barriers to doing this type of stuff, it's really the priority of the organization. So when you think about pharma, the priority of the organization is the drug pipeline, how do we get drugs to market, how do we commercialize it, things like that. And quality is really one of the last priorities, but it's also something that's very important. So what we're doing at AstraZeneca is how do we make quality into an analytics problem? And it's unique in that it's a regulated environment, and we're looking into like people data in depth that I never even knew was possible. So, what I'm going to do throughout this talk is go through some pretty concrete examples of how we've integrated people throughout my career, some of the barriers, some of the things you can do to break down those barriers, and how to think about people and all of the different problems that you might be facing within your organization. And so I kind of went back to ChatGPT and I said, give me a definition that more meets what I want to talk about at this People Analytics Summit. So I changed it to more of a multidisciplinary approach that uses data-driven insights to integrate into different areas of the business and things like that. So that's the other thing I like about things like Gen AI and ChatGPT is you can kind of tweak it to fit your needs. And some of the examples of how to integrate this into the different areas of the business, and we're all probably quite familiar with this, but when it comes to the operations space, so how do you think about productivity, efficiency? In the finance space, can you actually plan out your budgeting and resource allocation for the next year, 5 years, 2 years, et cetera? When you're talking about risk management, is there any compliance and safety risk because of the things that are happening with your people? And then customer service, this is a pretty obvious one, but do your customer ratings align with what your performance of your employees are, or length of service, things like that? So within Hamilton Health Sciences in the healthcare space, I kind of went into that organization and built up an analytics brand. So we called it My Insights. And essentially what we were doing is going to each area of the business. So we go into finance, we obviously went into HR as well to work on workforce problems, OR optimizations and things like that, so OR procedures, pharmacy. And within each of those areas, I was always kind of surprised by the problems that they were thinking about and how people was always kind of the last thought that they were thinking about when they were trying to think about a problem. So it was really interesting to go to these different areas within healthcare and kind of overhaul the analytics strategy and really think about some of these problems. And I was always the first one, well, what about the people? What about the nursing side of things? How are we thinking about these problems? And so, of course, we built up an HR suite of reporting looking at like workforce planning, so compensation, FTE planning versus actuals, turnover and churn, recruitment and openings. And I don't know if anybody knows this, but I was working in Hamilton Health Sciences during a thing called COVID. So what happened during COVID is it's kind of cool to be in an extreme situation like that, even if it is a really bad negative thing happening to the world, because it puts a lot of pressure on your business decision making, especially when you're in an area like healthcare. And so we started to focus, I'm not sure what happened there. So we started to focus way more on FTE planning, turnover and churn, because there was a huge nursing shortage at that time during COVID, and lots of pressures from patient volume and things like that. And we wanted to understand whether or not our care was being impacted. Recruitment and openings, and going a step beyond that by looking at, for example, what's the statistics of like nursing graduations? Is it actually decreasing, and is that changing like our pipeline of the resources that we're getting? And then we're obviously looking at things like OT, sick, vacation, training, anything that would keep nursing away from the units that we needed to care for. Employee demographics, so for example, are some of the pressures we're seeing because of the fact that there's a years of experience gap on some of these units. So understanding things like the different units, the different pressures that they have in a hospital, for example, like ICU or ER versus like cardiology, and whether or not you have the likelihood of nursing resources to leave because of those pressures. And then things like vacation balances, which we didn't really think about at first, but if you have all these nursing resources and they're not taking any vacation for the first 6 months of the year, that's going to create a lot of pressure on your organization during the last half of the year. And so when you think about people analytics and you think about people data, it has a tremendous amount of power when you're thinking about that HR space and all of the different problems that you can solve with that data. But in my experience, the power of people data gets even more powerful when you start to integrate it into the other areas of your business. So when you think about operations and you're really just tying volume and people together, and I don't know how many times in my career I've gone to executives, leaders, et cetera, and said, well, do we understand the relationship between the people and the volume of the things that we're putting out there? And you can think about that as an organization of the number of goods that you sell, but you can also think about it of like the number of activities that you might do in each area of the business as well. And then when you go into the finance side of things, it's the same kind of dynamic, but how are you using that volume plus people aspect to then plan for the future? So do we have the right people right now, and do we have the right people for what our plan is for the future? An example of that is at AstraZeneca, we have this 2030 bold ambition to add 20 new medicines. Well, I'm in quality. What does that mean for the number of quality resources I'm going to need in 2030? And then risk management. Do things like years of experience, churn, turnover, impact safety, quality, things like that. And then customer service. This is a reach for me, but I had to put something on there. So performance versus quality. And how do you look at the things like that? So I'm going to go into a really impactful example that I worked on at Hamilton Health Sciences that kind of shows this dynamic of embedding people into bigger business problems than you might be thinking at first. So one of the things that we worked at Hamilton Health Sciences, and again, this was during COVID, so just to understand the context and the dynamic of healthcare during that time is less people were going to the ER because it was COVID. You wouldn't just go if you had like cold symptoms or flu-like symptoms, which is the case normally. OR procedures were basically halted at a point in time. So two of the methodologies that we were working on in the AI space is how do we actually predict ER visits and what does the new normal look like after COVID? And then the other thing we were looking at is can we actually optimize our OR procedures after COVID? What is the right mix of procedures to bring back up? How do we get back to normal from this COVID thing where we were stopping all of the like little surgeries and things like that people would do? And so we built out this digital twin. And I don't want to get into too much depth into this modeling and stuff because it's really just about the philosophy here. But essentially what we did is there's two main ways that patients get into a hospital, through ER visits and through OR procedures. So if you can predict the ER visits, that's one part of the problem. And if you can optimize or manage your mix of OR procedures, then you can also kind of understand the other way that patients get into the hospital. Then that massive jumble of spaghetti or mix there is all of the different patient pathways through the hospitals that we were able to map. So from the point that somebody's admitted into the hospital, and this is just done through like historical ratios, which we did with like bootstrapping, which is a way to get like smart averages essentially. So what we were able to do is actually map what is the common pathways that patients take through the hospital. And by being able to do that on both an annual and a monthly basis, we're able to understand, okay, what is our patient volumes that are going through each unit on a monthly, annual basis through the hospitals? Does that make sense to everybody? Awesome. And so that's the volume side of things and how we work to predict that. And then how do we kind of include the people element in this? So at the same time, we are working to understand nursing resourcing specifically, because like I said, there was a nursing shortage. We had pressures in certain units of the hospitals, and probably a lot of you might know this just from the news, but the ICUs were kind of slammed. We had issues with nursing resources not wanting to work in the ICU because it was such a high pressure, tense environment. And you can envision that across like many different units in the hospital. So how do we like optimize the resources that we have in these different areas? Because we had paused surgeries in certain areas, the patient flows weren't going to some of those areas as well. So it's just kind of like an interesting problem to work through. So essentially what we worked on is hours per patient day, which is how do we break down the nursing component of this and how do we break down the volume component of this and understand it as a function of each other? So what we did is we actually used this system called Kronos, which is a scheduling system, and probably the worst system I've ever had to get data out of. And what we had to understand is how do we compare nursing and patients at the same level? So we were comparing at the shift level, at that 24-hour period, what's the number of nursing hours versus the number of patients in a unit at that time. You divide nursing hours by patient days to get your hours per patient day. Don't worry, there's not going to be a test. And I'm sure everybody wasn't signing up for this to go through functions and things like that at this time in the morning, but it's just to kind of show the ability to kind of mesh these things together. And so you start to combine these things together. If you can predict your patient volume and you can predict it on an annual and monthly basis, and you have your function, which is nursing hours by patient day, that gives you the ability to then calculate out what's your nursing requirement by unit as well. So it's not only a way to measure the levels of productivity within your organization, but it's also a way to kind of unlock the volume to the resource side of things and predict that. And the impact of this really was it overhauled nursing planning in the hospital. It allowed us to predict resourcing based on volume. And when we talk about barriers and silos, that was a hard thing to get across to people who have been working in the industry for like 10, 20 years. You can't tell us about nursing resource levels, hours per patient days, every unit's different, et cetera. And it really was an effort to kind of break down some of these barriers, and I'll talk about some of those after this. We were able to protection from burnout of nursing resources and units because of high churn, turnover, low average length of service in some of these areas. So we had new nursing graduates that were coming into the ICU and getting overwhelmed and things like that. And then standardized benchmarking for nursing levels across like units. So in your ICUs, do they all have the same level of nurse to patient ratios, things like that. And that was where you start to talk about managing your current resources versus predicting the future type thing. And then it also helped us to optimize patient pathways. So are there certain patient pathways where we just have too many nursing resources on now? Or are there patient pathways where we have too little or too few nursing resources on now as well? And there's some decisions we can make on the type of OR procedures we want to do and things like that, which can amend the pressures that you might have on your organization. So this isn't meant to be exhaustive. These are the top kind of barriers that I thought about that I see when I'm trying to build up this stuff in an organization. But one of them is policy. And specifically when you're talking about a global, organization, this gets compounded when you start talking about like GDPR, looking at employee data across the global markets, things like that. But we all have to deal with this in some form or function, right? So what is the privacy? What is the sensitivity? What's the difference between privacy and sensitivity? And it's one of the first things that HR always kind of throws up at you when you ask if you can get their data. And then silos, so silos of data. Specifically at AstraZeneca, we're dealing with this on a day-by-day basis, but how do we actually break down the silos? So in the quality area, how do we actually get access to all of our people data? And that's an ongoing struggle. And we're slowly working to unlock all of the different systems that we have available to us. And I'm sure every organization has those challenges as well. And then I want to talk about this idea of like silos of vision or like silos of road mapping. So it's like, are you thinking about the whole analytics problem, the people side of it when you're dealing with all of these different problems that you might be working with? And sometimes I see that businesses, functions, organizations think about their problems in like a vacuum, and they're not necessarily bringing in that people element. And then I know probably everybody in this room's dealt with this, but HR systems are not the easiest to get data out of. And I have one analyst who I had to get counseling for after using Kronos, which is the scheduling system we used at Hamilton Health Sciences. And it's just like, a lot of these systems are built for a purposes, specifically like LMSs, scheduling systems. And I don't think anybody at these companies is thinking about how anybody's going to get that data out of the back end and how they can actually leverage it. And then priority. And it just seems to me throughout my experience in all these different industries, all these different organizations, it's like people think about the cost, they think about the revenue, they think about the profit. And it seems like people might always be a secondary priority, or it's blocked behind some sort of blocker that they don't want to get behind. So I don't know how many times I've heard, well, that's sensitive data, we can't use it. And it's like, okay, well, we actually can if it's fit for purpose type thing. So it's just how do you kind of get past those initial reactions from executives of, oh, we can't use that, it's too sensitive. And so this is another fun thing to do in the morning, is to try and give an explanation of how pharmaceuticals work in one slide. So at AstraZeneca, it's even a step beyond healthcare. So we're a regulated environment. We're looking at people data, people things that I never even thought we'd look at before. And I'll go through some examples of what those are. But essentially, I run our clinical operations quality organization. And essentially, what we've done, and people, like I said before, you might think that pharma is quite far advanced because of how much money they make and everything like that. But there's a weird dynamic in pharma in that they make so much money that they throw a lot of FTEs at every problem. But now the pressures of competition, all these different things are coming to the forefront, and they're starting to think about how do we actually make our organizations more efficient. And that's where our group comes in. We look across all of the hundreds of clinical trials that we're doing globally and understand how can we actually begin to optimize some of this work, and how can we actually make clinical operations quality into an analytics exercise. So essentially what we're doing is we're looking across study A, B, C. We do upwards of 400 clinical trials in a year. So we're trying to automate what does it look like to measure all of these things across these clinical trials globally. So essentially what it boils down to is when a clinical trial is going through submission, we submit it to a regulatory authority before it can go to market. The most popular one is the FDA, obviously, which everybody's familiar with. We deal with Health Canada. We deal with MHRA in the UK. And essentially what we're looking at is, does what the study team did align with regulatory guidelines and our standard operating procedures that we set out? And really what we need to prove to the FDA, these regulatory bodies, is that we had adequate oversight of our clinical trials. And AstraZeneca is kind of leading the way here in that what we came in and said is that we believe that quality is actually just an analytics problem. It's a data governance problem. So what we're actually doing is just saying, okay, if our people are working in clinical trials, we're working on something called a clinical trial management system, which is basically like your SAP for your clinical trial. They're already doing all these tasks in this system. Why are we then making them track all this stuff in an Excel file or a Word document or a PowerPoint, to Ian's point in his talk? So really, we're kind of revolutionizing the way that we do clinical trials. And I've become pretty popular in the industry talking about this stuff, but how do we actually break down all these barriers between our system data and start to measure this stuff and get that across to the organization so we can have safer, more effective clinical trials for our patients? And so some of the areas that we're looking into is like adequate training. So how do we measure that? 2 years ago, I couldn't even tell you how we would measure that. But now we can get all of our training data out of our LMS. We can get all of our training completion marked out of our clinical trial management software that we have as well. And we're going beyond that. So within the clinical trial space, we have what we call quality events. And that's when somebody does something in a clinical trial that does not align with regulations or SOPs and things like that. And some of this stuff is really minor, like they didn't put a document into a system and things like that. But essentially what we can do is we're using Gen AI to categorize all of those quality events based on the text that's written in them. And then we can tie those categories to the different training modules that we have globally. And we use that as a way to start to begin to measure training effectiveness. So our theory is that if the training is effective, that our quality events will go down across those areas where we're doing the training for. Adequate oversight, so this is where you start to begin all the people data that we look at. So personnel visit tracking, so we run clinical trials out of different hospital sites globally, and there's certain roles that have to go in and visit those trials, and we actually have to document whether or not they visited those clinical trials. So one of those roles is called a principal investigator. So we're tracking whether or not they're visiting a site and things like that. CV and job description uploads by study. So we need to be able to prove to regulators that our study teams are actually have the right education, expertise to be doing that job that they have within those studies as well. So we have to be able to actually show those CV and job descriptions to the regulatory authorities as well. And then study personnel, and this is a big one. I know a lot of people track turnover, churn in an organization, but we actually track it across all these different studies as well. And it's an interesting dynamic sometimes, like the HR policies go out there. So within AstraZeneca, it's got a really great culture. Within it, there's this philosophy that people should be able to get the experience that they want to get. So you see a lot of people moving between studies, moving between areas, and it's actually encouraged. But it also impacts the business. So how do we actually measure the churn between clinical trials or different areas and the impact that that has on the organization? And so just to give you an example of what all this looks like in a product, we put out this product called Study Quality Oversight. And essentially, I threw out some examples there, but if you want to think about a clinical trial and all the SOPs, there might be like 2,000 things that a study team can be measured on. And like maybe 200 of those are people related. And so what we've done is how do we get all of this data from our systems to just measure this stuff? Because Mark, who's with me here, he just went through an inspection last year. He can talk about how stressful that is. But what we're trying to do is alleviate the stress on our workforce, increase employee satisfaction by reducing the burden of some of these manual activities that we're doing. And I love Ian's talk because those 5 words he put up there, all these shuns around digitization, democratization, peopletization. I'm making up words now, but that has been core to our philosophy as well. And how do we actually start to digitize some of these processes that are in between our systems so that we can uplift the capability to do this stuff in the future? And so when we talk about just some examples of some of that reporting, here's like our PI monitoring and visit attendance dashboard. So within this dashboard, we can measure whether or not our principal investigators are visiting our different sites, countries across the globe. And if it reaches a certain threshold or a percentage below a certain mark, then it gets flagged. And then the second thing I'm going to show here is study personnel, and this is something that we're working on right now. And when you talk about digitization, we have something called the study storyboard, which is done across all of our clinical trials. And if you can envision what a mess this is, it's a 20-tab Excel file. Every single tab is inputted manually from different systems. And just one of the tabs is called study personnel. So in 2024, 2025, our study teams are actually measuring people leaving, joining, coming into clinical trials in an Excel file. And Mark and I come in and we're like, what are you guys doing? All of this is within our systems. We can pull it out of the system automatically and put it right into a Power BI report. And not only that, can we do that, we can also automatically flag those quality signals associated with that. So when you look at a report like this, not only are we automating something that's being done in the current state, but then we're also uplifting the capability of what they were doing in the first place. So when you think about quality signals related to study personnel in a clinical trial, the things that we could be dinged on in an inspection finding is, do you have study personnel with no email? Or do you have study personnel with no end date? Or do you have study personnel been on the study for longer than 3 years, less than 3 months? And these are things that we can automatically flag through the power of analytics. And not only can we flag that in reporting, but we can also embed notifications right within like Microsoft Teams. So we can take it a step further than reporting with some of the technology that we have available to us. So not only do we flag these quality signals, but we can also send out, oh, this study, you're missing an email address on this personnel. And some of the other areas that we're looking into, so quality compliance, so do we match what was said in the SOP? And again, when I first looked at this, I'm like, okay, well, this is just data governance. How do we begin to automate it? Risk. Does the average years of experience of a study team impact the number of quality events that you might be getting? And nobody's ever really looked at it like that. Planning, how many quality resources will we need in 2030 if our portfolio is growing by this much, and we know that there's a high correlation between the number of patients in our studies and the number of quality activities that we do. And then what's the impact of training on quality, like I mentioned. And really the impact of all this is we've had reduced stress during inspections, improved efficiency and reduction in manual tasks and tracking, so Excel, PowerPoint, Words, improved quality and patient safety, and visibility to quality risks across the enterprise by being able to do this. So not only do we do this at the study level, but we can surface up these risks at an organizational level as well. And just to kind of give a barrier, it's really about give a summary, sorry. We got barriers on my mind, but how do you break down those barriers? How do you bring people into these different areas of your business? I know I'm preaching to the choir here in this room, but think of the people. Think about it at the organizational level. Think about it at the individual function level, and think about it at the specific business problem that you're trying to solve, and how do you bring people element into that. Make people data a priority. Make sure you're thinking of problems in an integrated fashion, and have fun, explore, and innovate. So if you think there might be a relationship between people and the problem that you're trying to solve, explore it. That's what data science is all about and all these different things, right? So that's my talk. I think we're at time here. So thank you so much for having me. And I'll be around all next few days. So. Thank you.
Nice job, Kevin. I think we have a minute just for a question or two. If anyone has questions, something that really struck me was the integrated approach that you're taking and the common challenges that you see in different functions, not unique to HR, in case anyone's wondering. These problems are endemic. Who has a question for Kevin? I think Esther.
Thank you. Hi, Esther. I am just curious if you can talk a little bit about your approach to understanding the business. It sounds like instead of going and saying, what do you want, what can I build for you, you're saying, what are you doing? And I'm curious how you learn about the business and sort of get ramped up quickly for that.
Yeah, so it's an interesting dynamic because on one hand, you always have executives saying, are we actively listening to our stakeholders, right? And at the same time, I see all these metrics that are tracked across our business that don't actually capture the reality. Sorry, I got a little feedback here. Don't actually capture the reality of what people are doing, right? So it's like, I sat in a meeting this week where we have our site management and monitoring organization, and they're talking to me about how they track these metrics because they've always tracked these metrics. And they're very high level metrics. And what I'm challenging them on is, okay, well, have you actually met with the people who are actually doing these tasks globally across your SMM organization and understanding exactly what they're doing? And that's essentially what we did at AstraZeneca is we go to stakeholders, we get the high level things that executives want, so we do the active listening. We go to their leaders, we understand what they want to get out of it, but then we make sure that we actually go into the business and understand what are people doing at the ground floor, because that's not just impactful for the solutions that you're going to be creating and making sure that you have the visibility throughout all of the chains of analytics that you want to do, but it's the greatest thing for adoption. So if you think about an organization like AstraZeneca, we have 20,000 people in R&D, which is the organization that we service, and 13,000 of those are our study teams. So if you can think about what it means to win those people over with digitization, automation of tasks, things like that, as well as building impactful solutions, it's just you got a lot of people cheering for you, and you got a lot of people going to their leaders saying we want more and more and more type thing. So does that answer your question? Okay.
Great question. Kevin, thanks again. Let's give it up for Kevin one more time.